Do you know what time it is? Time. Does anybody know what time it is? Are we at 10:19? Oh my gosh. Wow, we're late. All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad y'all are here. We had, on Thursday was the Bridge Institute, and Eliza Griswold was a speaker, and Terry and I went to the thing, and we walk in, and as I walk in, there's like one of the little standing tables, and Tom and Laura are there. And as I walk in, Laura turns around and she's like, "Scott Burch, we were just talking about you." And I was like, "Oh no, this is bad." But fortunately, they weren't there to excommunicate me. So I passed the heresy bar last week, and so I should be okay. Fingers crossed. I forgot my stand. So you just want to scoot this over just a tad. Hopefully that'll be okay. So anyway, welcome. Before we get started, I just wanted to have a quick conversation about something that got mentioned last week. And somebody in class had been inspired to read, and they had found a book different than the ones that I am kind of basing the class off of. And she's like, "Oh, I was reading this book and cross-referencing, and this guy comes to different conclusions." And I was like, that's awesome, because if you take two biblical scholars and put them in a room, they'll give you 3 answers to the story. If you take 2 biblical scholars and put them in a cocktail party, they'll come up with 17 different answers. So it's kind of all about, we're trying to put, it's a spectrum, right? We're taking a bunch of pieces and we're trying to put them together. And the biblical text is one of the pieces, and I don't want to discount it, but we can't just say that it is literally true, because that's a statement of faith. That's not a statement of fact or data or science. So people say that, and if you want to take that on faith, that's fine, but you're limiting the rest of the conversation, and it's a matter of your own personal. So what I'm trying, and then on the other side is pure fiction. And I heard this a lot during college. Oh, there was just a bunch of old people and they wanted to control the masses, so they wrote the Bible and they wrote all this story just to kind of exert control. And none of it is true. And I think you could believe that as well. That's got its own set of beliefs. But I think from my personal study, there's too much evidence that shows that that is not actually the way it is either. So there's somewhere in the middle. So what I'm trying to present in the class is what I would call scholarly consensus. So when you take people with PhDs and doctorates and people who've devoted their entire lives and careers to studying these things, they have debates. And when they're at the cocktail parties, they argue about stuff. And there's not a single right answer. So I will say, this is what it says. That's my opinion. It falls in this kind of scholarly consensus. If I start disagreeing there's a couple of issues where I don't follow the scholarly consensus. And I'll tell you that and say, this is my opinion. I don't think it's this. I think it's either over here or over here. But there is no one right answer. So if you hear me say something and you're like, wow, that's ridiculous. How did he come up? That's totally fine. That's what we're here for, is to have that discussion and debate, because that's how we learn. So don't feel bad about asking questions, or if you disagree, saying, I disagree, let's talk about that some more, because, I think I said in my email last week, it's like having a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and we only have about 95 pieces. And we're trying, and so we put them together as best we can, and we're trying to get a picture and see what the whole picture looks like, even though we don't really know. We don't have all the pieces to fit it together. Okay, I'm going to start and just recap quickly the end of last week. Any questions from last week, though? Anything that anybody, burning thoughts or? All right, so we were talking about the historicity of the Exodus, whether it really happened or whether it didn't happen. And there's datings in the Bible. There's like an early dating of the Exodus. If you read in Kings, it says, Samuel started building the temple 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. That would put the Exodus here around 1450 BCE. But then the Exodus story talks about the Israelites helped to build the cities, and it names off the cities, Pi Ramses. Those were all built during the rule of Ramses II, so that would put the Exodus around 1250. It's about 150, 200 year difference. But the problem is, neither of those dates match all the evidence. And the problem is, there's problems with the dating if you go into the Bible. The early date, far too early. The late date fits with the construction of the cities, but the problem is at that point in time, Egypt was the superpower of the region. And they had military installations all throughout Canaan, the whole region. There's no documentation anywhere of 650,000, 1 million, 2 million people leaving Egypt. Just because there's no documentation doesn't mean it didn't happen, but you would think that somebody would have said, hey, what are all those people doing walking through my territory? So that creates a problem. We don't know when an Exodus may have occurred. We also say we don't know how big the Exodus is. The Bible says 600 to 650,000 men, warriors able to fight. You add in women, children, elderly, you're at easily 2 million people. And 2 million people can't wander around in the wilderness for 40 years and not leave a track. Think about the city of Jacksonville, the whole metropolitan area, St. Augustine, Fernandina, and we all said, let's go hike across the United States together to Seattle. We would leave a trace. There would be some evidence in our wake that we had moved through the country, because that's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. So there's really problems with the size of the Exodus as well. And again, just remember that all this area, this whole area here, which we think of as Israel or Canaan, was controlled by Egypt at the time of the Exodus.
Is there any evidence of what the total population was?
Yes, great question. The estimates of the total population of Egypt, and when I say Egypt, you have the whole Nile, but Egypt was really concentrated here in the Delta region. They estimate the population of Egypt to have been about 4 million people around that time, around during the time of Ramses, 1200. Those are estimates. So if you took 2 million Israelites, that's half the population leaving. Again, it's not like you had 100 million people and it's like, I'm not gonna really miss 2 million if they slide out. It's like half the population leaves. All of your, according to the story in the Bible, all of your labor, all of your everything comes to a grinding halt. So there would be some kind of record of that. So was there really an Exodus? Most scholars say no, at least not on the size of the Exodus as not as described in the Bible. There is documentation of Semitic people being enslaved in Egypt. There's documentation of Semitic peoples working in Egypt. We know slaves sometimes ran away. That's well documented as well. So there's probably some back and forth movement of people. There may have been an exodus or several exoduses or exodi, or however you say exodus plural, that are in the memories of the Israelites that form the basis of this foundation national story of theirs. No clear evidence, nothing to really nail that down. So most scholars would say no. But like we were talking earlier, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there are some very intriguing things about the Exodus. which we should get to here shortly. Number one is Moses, or at least the name Moses. In Exodus, chapter 2, verse 10, it says that when Moses got put in the basket, his mom put him in the basket, floated him down the Nile River because the Pharaoh was executing all the Semitic boys, all the Hebrew boys. And Pharaoh's daughter finds him in the reeds, and she gets him out of the basket, and she adopts him. And then she says, Pharaoh's daughter, who's Egyptian, says she named him Moses because Moses comes from the word masa, which means a Hebrew word, which means to draw out of the water. Why would the Pharaoh's daughter name him Hebrew name when her dad's running around killing all the Hebrew children? That doesn't make any sense. Masa is a Hebrew word, but it's not a very common Hebrew word. It's normally when you take water or take something out of the water, there's other Hebrew words that you generally use. So most scholars think that this was a linguistic stretch or a pun or an analogy to try to give Moses a name because his name wasn't really Hebrew, it was Egyptian. The name Mose is in Egyptian means child of or son of. So Ramses is a form of that. He's the son of Ra, the sun god, or the child of the sun god. Thutmose, he's the son of Thoth. So those are very common names, and pretty much all scholars agree that Moses is not a Hebrew name, it's an Egyptian name. Why is that important? In scholarship, when you're looking for, is something written in a text true or not? If it goes against the story line or it undercuts your position, it's more likely to be true than if it supports your position. Here's the classic example. Jesus was being proclaimed by Christians as God, yet they all said Jesus was crucified. Who wants their God to be crucified? That doesn't make sense. But they knew, good morning. Here's some seats right over here. If y'all want to somebody maybe could help them unhook some chairs. So it doesn't help the Christian's case to say that Jesus was crucified. I mean, wouldn't you rather say Jesus came and he's God and he set up and he defeated the Romans? And, and if you're a Roman citizen and you're trying to say, let's be, should I convert to this new religion? It's like, wait a minute, your leader got crucified by the Romans? So historians would say that statement is more likely to be true because the Christians took it and owned it because they couldn't get away from the fact that it was true. Same way, Moses being an Egyptian name, they're trying to work their way around it by saying, it's this Hebrew word that means draw out of the water. But the fact is, it was probably an Egyptian name because Moses was Egyptian. Maybe he was Hebrew. Maybe the story of putting him in the basket and he was raised is true. Or maybe he's just an Egyptian. And he didn't, somehow became the leader of this group of runaway slaves or a group of runaway slaves. My personal feeling is that within the scholarly consensus here is that Moses is an Egyptian name. And my bet is that Moses was probably an Egyptian. The other one that's really interesting is when you get to Exodus 15, 1 through 18. And if you go through your Bibles and this afternoon and look, that's called the Song of the Sea. And it starts out and says, and after they got away, so the story, they get away and they part the Red Sea, everybody gets across, the waters come in and destroy. There's a whole long narrative, a couple of chapters where God saves the Israelites. And then they tell the story again, but in poetic form. This poetic form by most scholars would say is one of the oldest passages in the Bible, if not the oldest. And they do that based on the vocabulary. So if I gave you two samples of writing, and one was, hey, want to grab beer tonight? TBD. You know, that's text speak. That was not written by Shakespeare. Or if you say to be or not to be, that is the question of what should we do to shake off the mortal coil? It's been a while since I read Shakespeare. That's not something people just run around saying today. You can kind of group that. So by looking at the vocabulary, like looking at the grammar, most scholars say this is actually one of the oldest passages in the Bible. Were you going to say?
I was just going to say it is ultimately this is penultimate. They taught us the song
right.
in Hebrew when we were taking Hebrew in seminary.
Right.
And it's Shibru le Yahweh ki ga'o ga'a Zeus wa rokavo Ramah vayam.
Ah, wow, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah. So in Hebrew, I mean, you read the English version and it's kind of like, it's kind of poetry, but not really. But I mean, it's something that could be sung at night or around the campfire. It's a story that could be told. People say, linguistic scholars say that music, poetry, easier to remember than just prose stories. We've all played the game telephone where you say something at one end of the table, and by the time it gets to the other end of the table, around the circle, it's completely different. Everybody adds and spins the stories. But when it's in a poetry form or a musical form, people tend to stick to the lyrics because they kind of rhyme and go together. Most scholars date the writing of this, or the original, whenever it got originally written down, to about the time that we were saying the Exodus may have occurred. So in my book, that adds, it's not a late story. I think, and we're going to see here in a few minutes, there's a lot of late additions that get added into the story of the Exodus that were relevant for people in during the Babylonian exile or the late monarchic period. But I think the roots of the Exodus go way, way back to the very beginnings. So again, did it happen like it says in the Bible? My vote is probably not. But was there some kind of leader? Was there a leader named Moses who led some people out and maybe won some kind of military battle against Pharaoh's army? Maybe.
Would it be likely that it was a verbal history for a long, long time before it was written down?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. They clearly were working from sources. And I think, too, they didn't update the grammar, so I think there was probably a written source. We know that Hebrews were writing about this time. There was a Hebrew alphabet, and people were starting to write, so it's very possible it was maybe inscribed on a stone or on a tablet or something like that. And then that got carried on over the centuries. Before it actually got, the final editing, of course, took place around the time of the Babylonian exile, 500-ish BCE. But yeah, I think it's definitely an oral tradition. Yes?
With the Bible, the canon books of the Bible were decided in Nicaea 300. They decided we have to get this organized. Is there any possibility that the Hebrews did the same thing? They had all these stories floating around at the time and decided, we've got to get these organized.
Yes.
And we'll pick and choose amongst them, we'll consolidate them.
Yes.
So we have a uniform text.
Yes. Absolutely. I don't know when that happened. I don't think anybody really knows. We know that in around 100 to 200 BCE, they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And that is not good, because Greek at that point in time had become the common language and everybody was speaking Greek. And so that became the Septuagint. And we also know that that version of the Bible is what all of the New Testament writers used as a reference when they went back. And there's some famous alternative readings or alternative translations that they got from the Septuagint that are not in the Hebrew text. But scholars will still say that even at that point, the canon wasn't completely aligned, because the Septuagint version of Jeremiah is about 1/3 shorter than the Hebrew version of Jeremiah. And so most scholars will say they were still working on it. That was the canon that they saw. And the Septuagint is pretty much most 95%, 98% of what's in the Bible, but there were still instability in the text. Things were still getting revised and updated. The latest Hebrew version that we have dates to around 1000 CE, so 1000 years after Jesus. That's the oldest surviving text that we have of the Bible in Hebrew. So that's kind of the reference point. The Dead Sea Scrolls have versions of the Bible, but they're not exactly aligned with Septuagint or with the Masoretic text, which is kind of the definitive Hebrew text. So it's still a work in progress, but I think it mostly had its form. It was pretty close to what we have today. Great question. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the Song of the Sea, fantastic verse, which you just told us it was better in Hebrew. The Lord is a warrior, Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His elite officers were sunk in the sea of reeds. The Septuagint famously translated Yam Sup, which is Hebrew. I'm not a Hebrew expert, but from what I've read is Reed Sea or the Sea of Reeds, to the Red Sea. There are debates as to whether that was intentional because they had better information that they thought was more accurate, or whether it was just a mistranslation. Somebody just got it wrong.
Yeah, and there are no vowels in ancient Hebrew?
No vowels in
So
ancient
they didn't
Hebrews.
know if it was one E or two.
Or two E's, exactly. So I go with Sea of Reeds. I kind of go with stick with the Hebrew. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Remember in the creation story we talked about a few weeks ago, the water is chaos, it's disorder, it's the realm of sea monsters and others, and it's God who comes across the surface of the deep and brings order to the chaos. So by dumping the water, the fact that they drowned versus they all got shot by laser bolts from the sky says they were kind of dumped back into their primordial soup from where they came. You know, they are no longer of God. They are separated from God. I find that kind of interesting on a theological side. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waves. You stretched out your right hand and the earth swallowed them up. So it's kind of the same story. The other reason that scholars think this, there's no mention of Jerusalem. There's no mention of kings. There's none of the modern stuff that you often see imagery in any of this story. Not these passages. This is just a sampling of the whole thing. So super interesting. So our little graph, historicity of the Exodus, I tend to come down kind of over here. It's mostly a great story that has a lot to teach us. And let me just say again, I've said it before, just because it's not factually true doesn't mean that it's not spiritually or theologically true. You can convey great theological meaning and truth through a story. We talked about in the first class, Saving Private Ryan, right? Great moral truths were conveyed in that film, which was a fictional film. It was set during a real history of World War II, But that whole story never existed. Those people in the movie never existed. But great moral truths were conveyed through that. And I think it's the same thing here. So, but when we talk about the actual facts of it, I think Moses was a real guy. I think he was an Egyptian who probably led some people out of Egypt. I think there was some kind of historical remembrance of a battle with the Egyptians that the Israelites improbably won, maybe do, so.
Was
Yes.
what separated the Egyptian people versus the Semitic people, and was there a population in Canaan before?
Yeah. So the Canaanites are Semitic people. We're going to talk about that in next week. Their roots for a couple of weeks, the roots of where the Israelites come from. But there were a number of Canaanite city-states which were Semitic up through the land of Canaan. And in the surrounding territories, they were different ethnically from the Egyptians. And they were different ethnically from the Babylonians and the Persians, the Iranians. So they were a different ethnic group that are living side by side in the land.
So not all Canaanites had to come from the Exodus from Egypt.
No, the Israelites came from according to the story, the Israelites came from the Exodus, but there were Canaanites living in Canaan that God had promised to the Israelites, who had, if you go back to the story, if you follow the story and add in a little stuff, Joseph goes down to Egypt, gets sold into slavery. There's a great famine. His whole family comes down. They all live in Egypt, and then they all just hang out there. They're like, this is pretty good in Egypt. And then they end up becoming enslaved. You could argue that during that time when there weren't any Hebrews there, the Canaanites, the native people, started building these big city-states. And there's archaeological evidence of huge, large Canaanite city-states all throughout Canaan. The stories in Joshua are all about the Israelites conquering these city-states. So, but the Canaanites were Semitic people, and just a spoiler alert, a lot of scholars think that Israelites are actually Canaanites. They're actually the same people who maybe the underclass, there was the upper class and then the working class or the lower classes, that these people ran away. And maybe they didn't have a big exodus from Egypt, but maybe there was an exodus from the city-states, and they found refuge up in the hills, the hill country, and kind of started a new culture. It's a theory.
So our problem is that we are confusing ethnic groups with cultural groups.
Correct. Yeah, it could be, yes. They definitely had different cultures, and
Because ethnically, let me see how I can put it. Culturally, in the United States, we're all American, but ethnically, we're not all the same.
right.
So you have to keep in mind that one is not the other.
There's a difference, I think, and now I'm really at the ends of my area of expertise, so take this with a grain of salt. I think there's an ethnic difference between Semitic people and Egyptian people, and there's also a cultural difference between those people. There may not be an ethnic difference between Canaanites and Israelites, but there is maybe a cultural difference between Canaanites and Israelites. Man, you guys are... I didn't prepare for that question. I had a lot of other questions I was ready for. Next week. All right. I want to talk a little bit about some interesting tidbits that we find along the way in the story of Exodus. So we've kind of put the history behind us, but let's look at the story and what it can tell us, because I think there's some things that it can tell us. And this is what textual critics do, is they look at the story and kind of compare and contrast within the story to see if there's pieces. And this is my favorite story. Moses famously has the big argument with God in front of the burning bush. he's like, I don't want to go. And finally God's like, you're going. And so Moses is like, okay. And so he goes and they head off and they get to the first, like, he and his wife and his kids head off to go to Egypt, to go back to Egypt. And at a night encampment along the way, the Lord encountered him there and sought to kill him. We're assuming the him is Moses. So Zipporah, who is Moses' wife, took a flint, because she was smart and she knew what was going on, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his legs with it. Again, I don't know whose legs she's touching with the foreskin, but it's kind of gross. And said, you are truly a bridegroom of blood to me. And when he let him alone, when he, God, Yahweh, let him alone, she added a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. And it's like, what? What? Now, I brought my study Bible.
I thought you were going to have pictures.
No. I'd get kicked out for sure. I would get kicked out for sure. So this passage is right here, and there's a little footnote. And when I go down to the footnote, it says, the meaning of this passages is uncertain. I was, looking around on the internet, and there was like, there are pastors who, feel compelled to find theological meaning and everything in the Bible, and they were going through this whole thing. I don't think anybody knows what this is. But what it is an excellent example of source criticism or sources. There's different sources that we kind of talked about, the priestly source and the Yahwistic source. And so the Bible writers they had all these documents that they had collected over the centuries, and they're compiling it into one story. And they value the sources. It conflicts. Maybe it meant something to them. Maybe they didn't know what it meant either, but it was in their ancient sources. So they said, I don't want to get rid of it. And so they stuck it in there. And I don't know why it's there. I don't know what it really means. Maybe it meant something. It meant something to somebody along the way because they preserved this source and it was important to them. And I think when we read particularly the Old Testament, but it's true in the New Testament as well, there's some things that we don't make sense to us. These were not 21st century, highly educated, enlightened members of the scientific, society. They were ancient peoples. I don't want to say they're uneducated. They're very smart. They write great literature. It meant something important to them in their culture and in their time. But I don't know what it is. We've lost that. So I think we need to be careful. And I would say that to the internet preachers who are looking at stuff and say, what is the, be careful about how you interpret some of this.
So is that the first reference to circumcision? Because that clearly set the Jews apart from Gentiles.
Right. It is not the first reference. I mean, and again, this is where it gets tough into the dating. It's an older source, but it comes from the same source where Abraham, so the promise or the command to circumcise came to Abraham. So it's kind of all within. And it may have been that in this source, circumcision was critically important. That was the deciding factor. And so if somebody wasn't circumcised, they had to get circumcised right away. If you take this and you think about if it is some kind of literal something, or maybe it's a way to work around the fact that Moses was maybe an Egyptian. I don't know. There's a lot of ways. I think clearly circumcision is really important to these writers. What they're really trying to make is. But I find it interesting, we were talking about this before class, Satan didn't come to attack Moses. Wolves didn't come to attack Moses. God attacked Moses. In the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part, Yahweh is the source of blessing and also the source of judgment and death and punishment too. It all comes from God. Okay. Oh, yes. The plagues of Egypt. The plagues are awesome. And so I had something I forgot to tell you about earlier, so I'll tell you at the end. It's a good story, and I forgot it earlier. So we'll go through the plagues, and then when we stop, remind me to tell you the funny story. Okay, so the plagues of Egypt. So Exodus 4:23, Moses is still on the mountain. He's getting ready to head out. And God says to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all of the marvels that I have put within your power. However, I will stiffen his heart so that he will not let the people go. God is going to harden the heart of Pharaoh. Even though he wants the people to be released, he's going to prevent Pharaoh from doing it. And then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I have said to you, let my son go that he may worship me. Yet you refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son. So before any of this, Moses is still at the burning bush. And God lays out, here's what's going to happen in the story, in the text. Again, God is the one who's doing the punishments. And then Moses goes to Egypt famously. If you've seen the Ten Commandments, and Moses says, let my people go, and Pharaoh's like, no. And so Moses is like, Aaron, show him what you can do. So he throws his stick on the ground, and it turns into a snake. And the Pharaoh's like, here, hold my beer. Let me get my guys can do the same thing. And they throw their sticks on the ground, and they turn into snakes. And then Aaron's snake eats the other snakes, So it's all this, kind of it's like a bunch of middle school kids, right? Middle school boys, for certain. There have been I come from a very evangelical background and tradition, and in my upbringing, we were firmly on the literal side. Everything was literally true. But we also lived in a scientific, we had a lot of doctors and engineers and scientists and people who, knew science. And so there was a lot of effort expended to say, how do we, in a scientific world, explain the miracles stories? And so there were things like red tide. If you've ever been to the beach during red tide, it's horrible. It stings your eyes, the water is red. People have said, well, the Nile didn't really turn to blood, but they had this red tide or some kind of algae, and it made it undrinkable, and there's this problem, and there's that problem, and they have all these explanations, which are all possible. I mean, it's possible. Sometimes, famously, every time there's a hurricane, there's some religious person on TV or on the internet saying it's a judgment from God to whoever city got wiped out for, not following the rules. But I don't think, this is where I think you dilute, if you're taking a very literal take, you dilute the story, because now you're finding, well, all your cows got sick, and there was a virus, and there was a famine, or this or that, things happened. The point of the story is that Yahweh is more powerful than all of the Egyptian gods. When you start finding all the naturalistic explanations, it dilutes what is meant to show God's power and God's dominance. And from the passage before, God's not sending the plagues to convince Pharaoh, because even if it does convince him, God's going to harden his heart. He's making a point. He's driving home a point, and it's immaterial whether Pharaoh buys into it or not, because he's going to make the point no matter what. One of my professors said, it's kind of like a cat and mouse game. If you watch a cat with a mouse and they put their paw on the tail, and then they'll let it go for a second, and the mouse will start to run away, and then the cat jumps on it again, and he bats it around, and he's just playing with them. But we all know what's going to happen, is the cat's going to kill the mouse at the end of the day. So if you go and look at there's 3 places in the Bible where plagues are listed. We always famously talk about the 10 plagues. That's what's explained in Exodus 7 through 13. However, in Psalms, which again are older traditions, Psalms are, they have kind of the same, but they only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plagues. There's 9 plagues in Psalm 105. They're all kind of the same, but there's different traditions. Different people and different groups within Israel had different traditions as to what was going on here. But I think for me, when I read quite a bit about this, what these plagues are direct confrontations with Egyptian deity. So if you take the plagues, and I'll send you all the slides, and you guys can go down a rabbit hole this afternoon and Google it. But you can take the plagues, and they line up with Egyptian deities and what those Egyptian deities cover. So when the Nile gets turned to blood, one of the Egyptian gods is Hapi, the god of the Nile. The Egyptians depended on the god of the Nile, or the Nile, for their whole existence and economy. And just to remember, ancient Israelites were not monotheists. They believed in all these other gods. Even God says that. God doesn't say famously in the Ten Commandments, no other gods before me, because he should have just said, there are no other gods, it's only me, right? If they're a monotheist, it's like, I'm the only God, all those other gods are silly. But what God says in the Ten Commandments is no other gods. You worship me, not these other gods. These other countries and other peoples, they have their own gods. That's not for you to worship. You're supposed to worship me. That's what in the exile, in the Babylonian exile, as they reflect on what happened, they're like, that's what happened, is we were worshiping all these other gods. So this is the gods, Yahweh, not being the only God, but besting all of the Egyptian gods. And you can just kind of walk through the list. I've got a few here that are kind of interesting. Again, we talked about Hapi, the fertility god. This was a good one. Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth, and she is often depicted either as a frog or a woman with the head of a frog. And what was one of the plagues? Frogs. They're overrun with frogs. There's so many frogs that they're eating all the crops and destroying all the land. It's like a play on the words. You got a frog god? I'll give you some frogs. We'll see how you do when you have 1 million frogs everywhere. And you can go through the list. Hathor, one of the best known and popular deities in ancient Egypt. She's depicted often as a cow. Cows were kind of fertility. You know, if you got lots of cows and lots of cattle, everybody's going to be healthy. So she's often depicted either as a cow or again as a woman with a cow's head. What was one of the plagues? All the cattle were killed. All the cattle got wiped out. It's God, it's Yahweh going up against each of these gods and basically taking them down. It reminds me of My Cousin Vinny. Have you ever seen My Cousin Vinny? Yeah, so he's like Joe Pesci. He's like from Brooklyn or wherever, and he's down in Alabama trying the trial. And at the beginning, he's stumbling around, but then when he hits his rhythm and he defuses everything, and he's like, "I'm done with this guy. Get this guy out of here." He's like, "I don't need this guy. I got no more use for this guy." Great scenes. That's kind of what I picture here. God's just like, one by one, bring them on, Pharaoh. And each time, Pharaoh's like, "Oh, you guys are killing me. Get out." And God's like, "Nope, not yet." And he hardens his heart, and then they stay because they're all leading up to the last one. There was the sun god, Ra, but the last one was the death of the firstborn. And this one was directly against Pharaoh, because what happened at the beginning of the Exodus story? Pharaoh went out and wiped out all the Hebrew firstborns in the story. And so now it's payback time. And now it's like all of the firstborn are going to be taken out. there's a whole thing of firstborn child sacrifice that we're going to talk about later at some point, which is really an interesting topic. But basically, it's God saying the firstborn belonged to me, and it's also payback. So they did all these things. Pharaoh wouldn't go along with it, and in the middle of the night, the Lord. Some modern translations change it to an angel of the Lord came, but if you go back to the Hebrew, it's the Lord. It's God who comes and strikes down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, except for the Israelites who had practiced their first Passover, had put the blood on the doorposts. And Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, and Pharaoh arose in the night because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. And he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, up, depart from among us, you and the Israelites with you, go and worship your Lord, as you said. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone. Get out. And that was the last straw. Again, be careful when you let your kids and grandkids read the Bible, because some of it is not suitable for kids. The story of God going through and killing all the firstborn children of Israel or of Egypt is a rough story. How am I doing on time? Does anybody have the time? 11:06. All right. So a few other things, interesting versus disturbing. God is the one who stiffens and hardens Pharaoh's heart. Even if Pharaoh wanted to let the Israelites go, he couldn't let them go because God was preventing him from doing that. The plague of the firstborn, we talked about that, divine payback for Pharaoh killing the Israelite children. The Lord, and like I said all of this already. So I talked to you. I'm ahead of the game. I'm right on the game. All right, we'll wait till next week. I want to talk about the golden calf incident because that is a really interesting topic when it comes to trying to understand the Israelites who are sitting in a Babylonian exile. It'll take me like 20 minutes to go through it, so I don't want to do it now because we'll all be late. So we'll do it next week, and talk about that. Yes, Richard.
Tell us your story.
Sorry. So I was talking about different versions of scholars having different takes on things. So there was a group of scholars, biblical New Testament scholars in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they all got together and they formed what they called themselves the Jesus Seminar. And their quest was to try to find the historical Jesus, what was history, what was not history. And so they went through the New Testament, verse by verse, and they would debate and argue. Somebody would say, is this historical? Is this not historical? And it took them like 10 years to get through all of the different, all four of the Gospels. And what came out of it is this is a copy of the book they put out. And in the book, there's things in here that are all the things that Jesus said and the parables and everything are all in different colors. One color is the majority of scholars all agreed this goes back to Jesus. We all agreed that Jesus probably said either this actual statement or something very similar. One of the best known is the words, what we use for the words of institution. This is my body, which is broken for you. Take this cup. This is my blood given for you. Most everybody agrees that tradition goes back to Jesus. And then there's another color for, it might go back to Jesus, hard to say, not enough data to really clear. The third category is, it probably doesn't. There's a few convincing arguments, but the probability is it's not to Jesus. And then the final category was not Jesus at all. This came from somebody else put these words into Jesus's mouth in the book. So if you flip through this book, if you want to take a look at it, it's very interesting, and it's this group's of scholars' ideas. After this had been out and been published for a couple of years, a reporter asked Bart Ehrman, I don't know if you guys know Bart Ehrman, he's a New Testament scholar at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, well renowned. And they said, hey, the Jesus Seminar came to the conclusion that only about 20% of the things that are in the Bible actually go back to Jesus. In that first category of it's only about 20% of the things Jesus said. And they are like, do you agree with that? And he's like, absolutely. That is absolutely correct. The problem is they chose the wrong 20%. So there's always room for discussion and debate, and where do you fall on this? And and I think for me, that's one of the beauties of the Episcopal Church. From the very beginning, if you ever have taken church history, the Anglican Church was designed to be, when it split from the Catholic Church, they didn't want to go down a road, because some of the Protestants, the Lutherans and the Presbyterians they were all like trying to kill everybody else if you weren't a Lutheran or a Presbyterian. And so the church said, it's the Church of England, we're all English, we're all going to worship together, but it's a big tent, and you don't have to believe certain things. We can argue and debate, and that has become a foundational theological point of the Episcopal Church, is to come and reason and debate and talk about these things, which I think is fantastic. So that's what I love about this church. Thank you all for coming. If you have not filled out it, I sent this around a couple of weeks ago. It's name, address, text, or cell phone. If you'd like to get emails, we record the videos and put them on YouTube, and I send out the slides. If you'd like to get that, please, and you haven't filled this out already, come by and fill it out and put your name and contact information, and I'd be happy to send it to you. If you're like, it's enough listening to you one time, I don't want to hear you again, you can scratch your name off too, that's okay too. All right, thanks everybody, have a great week.